This is LXBN TV, and I'm Colin O'Keefe. With more than 40 million credit and debit card accounts compromised, the Target data breach is one of the most high-profile in recent memory. We're already beginning to see a wave of litigation, and we may even see some legislation as well. Joining me now to share his thoughts on each is attorney Jason Weisntein. He worked on cybercrimes like this during his time as Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Department of Justice and is now partner at Steptoe Johnson, where he is an author on the Steptoe Cyberblog. Jason, as we're now a few weeks out from this breach, let's start by looking ahead. What can Target expect as far as litigation goes, or are we seeing some already?
Well, one of the things that's been so striking about this breach, beyond the scope and sheer magnitude of it, is how fast and then the scope and speed of litigation response. Target now finds itself on the business end of something like 40 lawsuits at different courts throughout the country. At least about a half dozen of those were filed on the very same day that Target at first announced the breach. And the first of those was filed within just a few hours of Target's announcement of the breach. There are races to the courthouse, and then there's the Indy 500, and that's what this was. This was an extraordinary race to the courthouse. You and I have talked before about the fact that these data breach lawsuits are essentially like 21st century ambulance chasing. There are class action lawyers who scour the news every day for reports of data breaches, and then immediately respond with cookie cutter lawsuits that show no interest in what the actual facts were or actual factual development. But no matter how meritorious or not the cases may be, they're very expensive to defend. And now Target finds itself having to defend an extraordinary number of them all at the same time. But it's not just litigation. Target also finds itself under scrutiny from numerous state attorneys general who all have pieces of this consumer protection pie. They're almost certainly going to be the target of an FTC investigation. And ultimately, let's not forget, there will be litigation down the road with the credit card companies and the banks who have to cover the losses from the stolen credit and debit card data, and who have to cover the fraudulent transactions used with that data. You and I have talked before many times about the fact that this is a blame the victim environment. These companies like Target that find themselves victimized by hackers are then victimized again, as the public and the courts and regulators seem to blame them for not having done more to prevent the breach. It's almost like a bank manager being blamed for allowing his bank to be robbed. There's almost an assumption in the public comments so far, including by members of Congress, by the way, that this breach was somehow the result of something Target did or didn't do that it should have done. Instead of being guilty until proven innocent, they seem to be negligent until proven reasonable. And that's unfair. As you mentioned, when I was at DOJ, I oversaw the criminal investigations and prosecutions of some of the most significant data breaches in the country the last few years, including the TJX case, which is the biggest retail data breach. And I can tell you from the experience of working on those cases that just because a company got breached doesn't mean it did something wrong. You can have the best cybersecurity in the world and still be the victims of an attack. And it's way too early in this investigation to be assigning blame to anybody except the hackers who actually did the attack. What it's not too early for, though, is for other retailers to go to school on the nightmare that Target is experiencing right now. Target is in the middle of a legal and regulatory bad dream, and even if the cases ultimately are thrown out or successfully defended, and even if Target ultimately is found not to have done anything wrong, it's a very expensive nightmare that they're in. And this is a but for the grace of God moment for every other major retailer in this country, all of whom are at risk of having the exact same thing happen to them. And so this is a great time for other major retailers to look at the steps that they've taken to secure their networks and to deal with the legal and technical and administrative aspects of cybersecurity, and have lawyers and forensics experts come in from the outside under the protection of the attorney-client privilege and do a proactive privacy assessment, security assessment in those companies, which will put those companies in a much stronger position. If the worst happens and a breach occurs and they get sued, they'll be in a much better position to defend that litigation.
Definitely. And then second, what are your thoughts on the response from lawmakers? We've seen a bit of a push for some legislation. What do you think we'll see as far as legislation goes, or what do you think we should see as far as data breach legislation goes?
That's a great question. Already in the few weeks since this breach became publicly known, you've seen members of Congress calling for the FTC to investigate and calling for congressional hearings and asking questions about whether we need new legislation. I suspect you'll see a renewed call for a federal data breach notification law. Right now, there's a patchwork of laws in 46 states and a number of territories, but no uniform federal data breach notification standard. You may even see greater interest in the Hill on granting or clarifying, depending on your point of view, the FTC's authority to bring enforcement actions for data breaches, although there's no indication the FTC has been inhibited in any way from the lack of clear authority to do that. But in my view, what lawmakers should be focused on, more than those two things, is enhancing the ability of the government and the private sector to work together to go after the real culprits, who are the hackers who are actually stealing the data and selling it on the black market and creating nightmares for consumers, not only in this country, but throughout the world. This is not a problem the government can solve on its own, and I say that as somebody who oversaw the government's efforts to solve this problem. When I was at DOJ, I testified in the Senate a number of times about this, and on more than one occasion made the point to Hill staffers and to members that the department just doesn't have the resources to deal with the scope of this problem. That was true when I said it a couple of years ago. It's even truer now with the sequester and hiring freezes and in a more difficult budget environment. But the fact is, even if DOJ's budget for cybercrime went up dramatically, the government still can't solve the problem on its own. You need a partnership, and you need the private sector and the government to work together. The government has very clear authority to go after the hackers, but doesn't have the resources. The private sector has the resources, but doesn't have the clear authority. And, Colin, imagine if within a few hours of discovering this attack, Target brought in outside computer forensics experts, and those people were able to trace the stolen data back to a server somewhere in Europe, where it was being stored temporarily while the bad guys decided what to do with it or who to sell it to. And what if those forensics experts were actually able to take action to encrypt that data or to delete it or otherwise to render it unusable by the bad guys? How many millions of cases of identity theft are going to be prevented? And how many millions of dollars of fraudulent transactions are going to be prevented? Isn't that a better, smarter thing to do than to just do what we do now, which is to wait for the data to be sold, wait for the fraudulent transactions to be committed, and then try to clean up the mess? So why doesn't that happen right now? It doesn't happen now because the Justice Department's view is that the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is the actual statute that we use to go after hackers, technically applies or could apply to a situation like the one I just described, where a victim company takes steps to trace the data back and finds it on the hacker's computer and then takes action to disable it or render it unusable. That could technically be a violation of the same statute that the hackers violated in the first place. And no company wants to risk criminal prosecution, even in the name of protecting its customers. The government's response to violent crime is not to tell people just to buy better body armor and to arm themselves at home. The government's response to violent crime is to go after violent criminals. But in the cyber world, we tell companies to build bigger walls, to buy better firewalls, to buy better security measures, and we focus on services to victims as well. We don't focus enough on punishing and deterring the attackers themselves. So my suggestion to members of Congress who are interested in legislation in the wake of Target is to focus on changes to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that would create reasonable, measured authority for private institutions that are victims of hacks to work in partnership with law enforcement to take reasonable measures to trace the data back to its source and to render it unusable so that we can prevent identity theft and prevent fraudulent transactions. This can be done, and it can be done in a way that is reasonable and responsible and doesn't open a can of worms and create a bunch of cyber vigilantes. And as I said, take it from somebody who's done this from the law enforcement side. Law enforcement can't do it alone, and it can only really be done if we work together with the private sector. It's just not enough to clean up the mess at the back end. We have to do more at the front end to prevent the stolen data from ever being used and to go after the people who are stealing it in the first place.
Absolutely. It's good to be proactive on these things. That's what we've talked about in the past, how retailers and companies need to be proactive to prevent these breaches, but it'd be good to be proactive in the response as well, and hopefully something will be created so we're not just waiting around for these breaches to get worse. Once again, that was attorney Jason Weisntein of Steptoe Johnson. For more of his insight on the Target data breach, be sure to visit steptoecyberblog.com. And of course, if you're not watching us here on our site, on LXBN, be sure to visit LXBN.com, where you can find curated commentary from the Lex Blog Network, the largest legal blog network in the world, and also hundreds more of these LXBN TV video interviews. Thank you for joining me today, Jason.
Thanks for having me, Colin.